There's no doubt that one of the highlights of motoring in the 70s has been the emergence and eventual acceptance of fun cars, sin bins, dune buggies and off-road four-wheel drive machinery. Cars like this with enough speed to test your skill and enough power to give you a bit of a thrill or two. But if it's getting harder and harder to find somewhere to drive vehicles like this, it doesn't seem to be reflected in the sales because they're still selling plenty of them, and yet they might not have existed at all if it hadn't been for a couple of world wars. The story of how the Army Jeep came into existence is one of those wonderful sagas of the power of a committee to slow things down drastically. After the First World War, the various Army design departments went to work to produce a light, nippy, low-profile vehicle for general purpose, and the first of these that actually went into operation was a Model T Ford. And it was good, up to the time where the Army decided to overload it with special equipment of one sort or another, and it became too heavy and almost totally unmanoeuvrable. By the time the decision was taken to build a four-wheel drive vehicle, the American Bantam Company was given an order to build 70 of them, and they were put under test, and these tests were watched by a representative of Ford and Willys. Subsequently, Willys and Ford were to share the manufacture of the Jeep right throughout the pre-war and Second World War years. The poor old Bantam Company missed out altogether, and when you consider that eventually some 600,000 Jeeps were built, it was a fairly large slice of the action to miss out on. Those of you who weren't actually in the war have probably seen thousands of movies in which the Jeep was definitely the hero. Not all of that was exaggerated. It really is a very rugged and versatile piece of equipment. But there are some things I've got some serious doubts about. Those occasions where you see a Jeep flying up on a piece of dirt road and then slide into a stop in all its glory, that's not on. It won't stop like that no matter how hard I push on the brakes. It's quite a lively performer as far as its engine and gearbox are concerned, and it certainly is enormously strong. But over about 50 miles an hour, I'd rather not be driving it. It feels decidedly unsafe. Incidentally, all those big tubby American Army sergeants, how they could drive a Jeep I don't know. I can barely fit in, and this is exactly the standard driving position. Even before the Jeep was in production, the Germans had introduced their own kind of off-road vehicle, and they called it the Kugelwagen. Like the Jeep, it became the hero of 1,000 war movies. It wasn't a four-wheel drive vehicle, but it was nevertheless very practical, if a little rough.
You'll not be surprised when I tell you that it was based entirely around Volkswagen components. And that will also tell you immediately what happened to all of those deposits paid by the German people for the German people's car before the war began. During the war, the Germans built 52,000 Kugelwagens and another 14,000 of its very pretty amphibious sister, the Schwimmwagen. First post-war non-military four-wheel drive off-road vehicle came out in 1948. And it was this, the ubiquitous Land Rover, of which this is the very first model. It was in fact the father of a whole generation of subsequent four-wheel drives, Toyota, Nissan, Suzuki, many others. Jeep also went on to make other four-wheel drive vehicles, but they became somewhat more luxurious, more Americanised. And Land Rover, over the years, remained exactly as it was originally conceived. That is, purely as a workhorse. And I mean exactly. The current Land Rover is almost no different at all from this first model. That suggests to me one of two things. Either that it was very, very good and there was absolutely no reason whatsoever to make any changes to it, or alternatively that Leyland designers and engineers have become somewhat lacking in imagination of late and not been able to keep up with the progress made by other people in the same rather specialised area. And I think probably the latter is true, because most other four-wheel drives have now passed the Land Rover in performance specifically. The Land Rover today is not much different from this, not very powerful, not particularly good on brakes. In fact, nothing more in any area than a pure workhorse. Apart from the development of heavy-duty vehicles, the Second World War had about the same effect on car manufacturers as the First. Virtually none, except to wipe out a few of the less efficient. In 1940, private car manufacture was just about at a standstill. By 1943, only 1,600 private vehicles were built in the entire United Kingdom. In the USA, by 1942, private car manufacture had been substantially reduced. Everybody was concentrating on the war effort, which is understandable, and while they were, new materials and new technology were being evolved, but their application to the private car had not yet been considered, with the result that the first spate of cars that were released as soon as the war ended were very much the same as those which had been on the market just before the war. In America, models from Chrysler and Chevrolet hardly varied at all from their pre-war counterparts, with Chevrolet still holding market leadership. The Ford Motor Company had yet to learn the aggressive marketing and management techniques that made GM's Chev such a success. In fact, the Ford Motor Company was in a mess, and one which it would take young Henry II some years to recover from. So what were those late 1940s American cars like to drive? Well, this is a Dodge of that period, a classic example, since there were in fact really only 4 or 5 major cars of the period that were significant. This was certainly one of them. There are, of course, millions of people still around who will recall from personal experiences what late 1940s cars were like. But there are equally millions of people who've never driven one or anything quite like it. So let's make some direct comparisons with the family cars of today. In the first place, they're about the same size as today's American cars. Big family sedans, a good bit heavier than they are today, because at this stage most of them were still built with real chassis. The engine is slow revving by today's standards, and certainly not a V8, although there were V8s coming available at this time. In this case, a straight 6 side valve, long stroke, low revs, high torque characteristics, meaning that you can drive the car in top gear almost everywhere. And again, because of that, no real need for automatic transmissions as yet. It's extremely comfortable. The driving position is good. You sit high, wide, have a good view of everything around you, and a good relationship between the controls and the steering wheel, and a good seat with a certain amount of give in it, but at the same time enough support under your bottom and for your back to make operating it for long periods of time quite a pleasure. And again, an important feature, because at this point lots of people were taking off on really long distance trips. In other areas it's quite definitely 1940s, and by comparison with today's cars leaves a bit to be desired. The brakes are adequate but not brilliant. The handling is barely even adequate. Wobbles about in corners a bit, and it's certainly not too direct in the steering department, and you can feel the rather old-fashioned suspension working away down there, absorbing shocks all right, but not doing too much to help to keep you pointed in precisely the right direction in corners. Despite those criticisms, however, I can imagine that a car of this era, with some of today's features, would be a real pleasure to drive. Absolutely simple, no complications whatsoever, and with the ability to go and go and go almost forever. In Europe, both the Peugeot and Fiat factories had been completely destroyed, and most of the British factories were virtually old and worn out. In Germany, 3/4 of the Daimler-Benz plant had been destroyed, and in fact, the directors stated that the company had virtually ceased to exist. BMW and Auto Union were now behind the Russian lines. Aircraft and military manufacturing techniques had taught everybody the benefits of high compression engines, and yet no one built them because there was no high-grade fuel available for them. And for those manufacturers who were in a position to get going again, there was virtually no steel. For 2, maybe 3 years, a sort of silence hung over the industry. And then in 1948, there was a great explosion of activity. Because of the war, and largely because of the prevailing economic conditions, this explosion on opposite sides of the Atlantic took on opposing philosophies. The Americans, affluent, politically stable, swung into their highly developed mass production techniques and built expansive, soft-riding, technically expendable cars for the masses, almost all of whom could afford to buy them. In Europe, depressed, reconstructing and substantially broke, they took note of their technological expertise to build small, highly efficient, long-lasting cars in lower production runs for a much less affluent market. These opposing philosophies were significant. They were going to last for another 30 years. The end of the war in France was a time for bitter recriminations and revenge. Louis Renault, for good reasons or for bad, was charged with collaboration with the enemy, imprisoned, treated very badly, and within a month was dead. His business was nationalised, but within 2 years they were producing this car. This is the 4 Chevaux Renault, 4CV, 4 horsepower, 750, or just a baby Renault, depending on where you were when you took delivery of your new little car.
It became, overnight, a very popular vehicle in France. It took a little while to catch on in the rest of the world, but it did gain some popularity there. It was very small, but it was also very pretty. And it performed remarkably well, and particularly in comparison with small cars that were built before the war. In fact, it was a degree of performance that got a great many drivers into some trouble, particularly since it was coupled with a swing axle system at the back. As it happens, I'm sitting in a version that was built specifically for the Le Mans race, for the index of performance class, of course, because the little Renault had no chance of winning outright. It was nevertheless a very spirited version, and when the choice came for me to drive either the standard car or the Le Mans car, obviously. Citroën were not too badly affected by the war, apart from the loss of all of their records, and their immediate post-war effort was really quite impressive. But it was not until 1948 that they released the 2 Chevaux, the car which was to symbolise France just as effectively as the Eiffel Tower. This was a prototype for a model which is still in production. Have you ever seen anything more grotesque? The Peugeot organisation, after their rebuild, released the 203, which survived in production until 1960. Armand Peugeot was in fact the first builder of cars in France. When Edouard Sarrazin acquired the rights to Daimler engines, Peugeot realised the possibilities immediately and went about constructing an automobile. The 203 carries on the traditions of all Peugeots: good quality, strongly built, and a great deal of fun and sport to drive. The 203 was a very accurate steering car with almost superb, unequalled road holding for its time, and that is 1949. By today's standards, the 203 is slow, but it made up for that with a great many other endearing qualities which made it very popular. In Italy at this time, nobody was producing any cars of real note, but there was an era about to develop which involved some really great styling, with names like Bertone and Pininfarina emerging. They were to have a great influence on the shape of cars to come. And in England, 2 cars of note were released: the Jaguar XK120 and the Morris Minor, which incidentally is the car that first aroused my enthusiasm for motoring. This is the very first Morris Minor Series MM released in 1948. For me, it brings back vivid memories. In 1949, my family acquired their first car, and it was a little side valve, low light Morris Minor. I was 13, and I learned to drive on it. I learnt very quickly, and I learnt well because it was a good little car. And in fact, if it hadn't been as good as it was, I seriously doubt that I'd have been here doing this sort of program today. I believe that this Morris Minor, in a second generation form, re-released,
put back on the market again today, would sell a second million versions. It was that good. It didn't have a great deal of power. In its original form, a little side valve engine that was a carryover from the pre-war years, but it did handle brilliantly. It had great rack and pinion steering. It did stop well. It was light. It was strong. It was spacious. It was comfortable. It was safe. There was a great many things that cars that are supposedly better have stopped being since the Morris Minor was taken from the market.
It's really strange how your sense of values change over the years. When the XK120 was first released, I thought it was at least the best car ever conceived by man. And then over the years it was replaced by fantasy cars of one sort or another, and later in life I got to drive one. And it occurred to me that it was never really a good car at all. It was just a very exciting car with some good points, none of which were quite as good as its engine, which was always superb. Handling was a bit suspect, long wheelbase, narrow track, and a bit funny at times, and although its brakes were good, there were other areas in which it wasn't up to scratch by anybody's stretch of the imagination. The gearbox was rather strange, a long shift and very slow because of slow synchromesh, which meant that you could never really make a fast change with it, and the driving position was decidedly cramped, a throwback perhaps to the early SS Jaguars, particularly in view of the fact that most people who drove Jaguars would have wanted to drive them fast. If you happen to be over 5 feet 10 inches tall, you were in plenty of trouble. But it was a beautiful looking car, and it captured the public's imagination immediately. Of course, nobody could say that the latest in a long line of MGs was not also of interest. This is the MG-TC of the late 40s. The little 1250 MG is considered to be the last of the true sports cars. It was always a high-spirited car, never brilliant, always a great deal of fun to drive, provided, of course, that you were a masochist. It had a good little gearbox, fast through all 4 speeds, nippy, light, quite accurate steering, but it was almost impossible to handle, dancing and skipping and jumping all over the road, and it took something like superhuman effort just to keep it pointed in the right direction. How people raced it, I'll never know. The engine was not particularly powerful, but it was willing enough in the right hands, and especially when it was stirred along with its gearbox. The speed on the road was good, but as I repeat, it was exceedingly difficult to drive really well. Even while the war was still going on, and in line with their continuing expansionist policy, General Motors decided to begin manufacturing in Australia. Their decision was based upon the fact that Australia was probably the only country that they could work in immediately following the war. And they were encouraged by a decision taken by the Australian government, which was to seek manufacturing plants for that country. The status of General Motors Holdens in Australia was agreed upon in 1945, still before the war had ended. In 1948, the 48215 series Holden was released. From that day onwards, Australia was saddled with cars based on American concepts. Considering that they had 60 years of the development of the automobile to draw upon for experience alone, and a whole new factory and a whole new market to sell to, one would have thought that General Motors might have come up with something really good for their first introduction into the Australian market. The first Holden was not a bad car. For 1948, it really was quite an effective package. The most important point being that it was very simple. It was kind of American, but it was scaled down somewhat to more compact size, had a fairly small Chevrolet-based six-cylinder engine, three-speed column shift transmission, a bench seat, a live rear axle with cart springs, all of the things that one would consider to be very basic, very simple, very ordinary, built down to a price which made it very popular. It was very cheap when it first came on the market, and at the same time it did offer quite reasonable family motoring, which was what was intended of the car all the time. However, now let's think about the critical points. It was a pretty evil handling thing, and it didn't have a great deal of power, and it didn't stop particularly well with its four-wheel drum brakes. And probably, once again, given those 60 years of development, General Motors could have come up with something better if they'd been drawing upon, for example, European expertise rather than the lack of technology which existed in America at the time, where the concern was simply to build cars for the masses regardless of the technical values that they might have placed upon it. What happened? Australia finished up with a car which was certainly by no means European, half American if you like, called Australia's own, but not totally Australian. The really sad part about it is that it was another 30-odd years before General Motors in Australia built another really good car.